Director of Public Transportation.
Patrick Quinn.
Mr. Bosky, are you on the phone? Mr. Steele, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am.
Thank you, Mr. Steele.
Pete Peterson.
Bill Evans.
That'll be great, Johnson.
Dick Train.
And then the audience, please.
Jed Smith, Public Transit Advisory Board.
Chris Shitty, Office of Economic Community Development.
Barbara Jones, municipal clerk. Honor Brass, deputy chief of staff.
Thank you. Mr. Hassan, you have the floor.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So before you have a packet, and what we've attempted to do is outline a multitude of things. The first 2 pages are comprised of our events that we call open houses in November. The very first page is the meetings that we're conducting all across the Bowl to the river in relation to official public comment periods. We're enabling individuals to come for the Public Advisory Board and have recorded comments. The third page here is a pullout, and the pullout is a demonstration of the process as we've been involved in, the public has been involved in, and here on the administration side. Having begun back in April of 2016, how the surveys were put forward. You, Jared Walker and Associates came before you, the Assembly, to do a presentation. There was a stakeholder committee, public outreach efforts then, and where we are today. Page 4 is a concept that has been before the Assembly previously, the choices that we initiated this process. We went out to the public, we did surveys, we requested their opinion, and what they have suggested was that they would prefer the alternative of having more frequencies, even though we would like to walk a little, even though that required them to walk a little longer, a little further from where the bus routes are, in lieu of the system that we have presently, which is a coverage-based model on a 50-50 split.
Can you go down one moment, Mr. Flynn?
Madam Chair, I just want to acknowledge, I believe Ms. Dombowski has reviewed this.
Thank you. Mr. Bosky?
Yep, I'm here, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Please continue.
And,
Oh, that cross guy's back too.
Crockett and Dunbar are coming with us.
For the record, we are also here.
Yeah.
All right, I recognize you, but thank you. Please continue.
The page after the notion of frequency over coverage is one that measures productivity. Throughout our efforts in November and December, what we discovered was that people wanted a quantification of what the ridership figures are in relation to their respective routes. To that end, we have compiled information we previously already had existing, and what you see is what the ridership is based on our AM, midday, PM peaks for respective routes in relation to the span of service. Perhaps the most important aspect are the preceding 3 pages, which is our existing network. Might I suggest it might be easier as we continue this conversation and dialogue that it would be helpful to pull out all 3 of these pages, which are the maps, so you can see a comparison between what our 2 concepts are, 80% and 100%, versus where we are existing. The last page is a summary of comments to date, the locations and the venues within which those comments were obtained. Our thought process is currently that at the end of December, once the official comment period is over, we will summarize and compile the comments that we've had on record and match them with resolutions in favor of one or the other plan that we obtained from a multitude of entities that we've been reaching out to, and submit that before the Assembly through the Advisory Board. The one other document that I had placed in front of you are all the news articles that we participated in our strategic effort to get the information. Our strategic effort to get the information out to the public, so that at the end of this, at a minimum, no one can come back and say that public transportation hasn't been at the forefront of being informative to the public for the past 2 months. With that, do you have any questions?
Any questions, any? I don't see any questions, Mr. Flynn.
Yeah. To the best of my knowledge, there's no specific action item for the Assembly related to this. It's more informational, but are there things that we will need to have to affect whatever route system? For example, will there be capital needs for new shelters to accommodate more frequent intersections of routes, or what are our responsibilities in moving this forward?
So that is a segue into the longer conversation. I think in terms of good faith and a fiduciary responsibility on our part, we want to make clear sort of the comments that we've been getting from the public, so that you're prepared for outreach that your constituency might do to you. And frankly, it's been a split in terms of our experience. We have individuals who are commenting that have heard sound bites on the news media, but they've not done the research. So what we're discovering is that we're having to fill in the knowledge gaps when we get to the official public hearing portion of this, because they're simply not educated to the process. What we've discovered is that the existing map, as an example, will show a multitude of routes that they're familiar with, and yet on the 80% and 100% map, what they see is numbers, because we've realigned our routes. And so even if the route actually goes to their neighborhood, they sometimes are confused and may believe that the route's no longer servicing their neighborhood. We've had some that favor the 100% concept because they see what the longer-term strategy is under the 100%, which I will elaborate on. And a predominant amount of them have stated that they would like to be left harmless, that the status quo is sufficient, and that the 80% is sufficient. Where we, from a departmental standpoint, are struggling with is a paradigmic shift or a philosophical shift. And philosophical or paradigmic shift is something that you as the Assembly are far more aware of than us as public transportation, because we're recipients. And this is the true measure of it. If you take public transportation and do a comparison between the inherent value-based needs from a priority standpoint, and you take public transportation to say APD, fire, or EMS, and it's a dollar for dollar value proposition, it becomes inherently difficult for us to compete with those value propositions. APD, fire, EMS will always be emergency level needs from a dollar value standpoint that we cannot compete with. And so what ends up happening is a narrative unfolds over a period of a number of years, stretching back a decade, maybe even further. And that narrative is continual cuts to public transportation, and rightfully so, because other priorities are higher priorities. But that in itself leads to a self-defeating prophecy of degradation of services, because we're going around neighborhoods and saying the budget has been cut, let's cut this route here, let's cut that route there. And pretty soon what you end up happening is a self-fulfilling prophecy where the ridership, lowering of the ridership justifies the very cuts that you do. And we do not see that changing in the next 5 years at a minimum. Perhaps later on it may. So the biggest confusion is, well, why even propose the 100% plan? And because the reason why we're proposing the 100% plan is one of the two concepts, is because it flips the table on what is a self-defeating prophecy. It's a vision to diversify the funding and the heavy reliance on local taxpayer base by saying that through this mechanism we can do a value proposition that in the long run is of a net benefit to the citizenry in your constituency within Anchorage, throughout Anchorage. But in order to do that, some sacrifices need to be made, some decisions need to be stomached here and now, so that we can build to that future. And the value here is simply this. What public transportation seeks to do is define a specific area in which you can do something right in public transportation. And so this area has been strategic in terms of we've taken a look at census level data to see where the bulk of the density is in terms of jobs. We've taken a look at where the bulk of the density is in terms of population. And so we work with a philosophy that when you have a dense population within proximity of a dense number of jobs, by inlaying a transit network that provides a greater level of frequency, you're doing one of two things. One, you're saving the value of time to individuals that probably don't even have cars. You know, we can go into the conversation of one car versus two cars or no cars, But that population is the segment that's the heaviest reliant on public transportation. What is the value of their time if they're no longer spending an hour or an hour and a half trying to meet connections, standing out in the cold, trying to get these 1 hour routes? It's time that they can better spend to perhaps spend with their family or educating themselves, because a lot of them have those multi or dual or dichotomous type of responsibility. What is the value proposition to the businesses that rely on that dense population? Well, it's demand management, because a lot of these folks aren't doing your classic 8 to 5 jobs behind a desk. They are retail workers. Thanksgiving opening up on Thursday evening, as an example, is a prime, the prime nuance there. They're being required to be at shifts that don't conform to the normal 8 to 5 schedule. How do we meet the demand of those shift changes? And if we can do that through a 100% level concept, then that's an additional value proposition that businesses have now that they previously didn't. Same thing with tourism in the 6-month peak period within Anchorage. If you have 3 million tourists, what are they relying on for transportation mechanisms throughout Anchorage? Is it taxis? Is it shuttle systems? It might be a combination of the two. It likely isn't public transportation. But if we were able to make a system fulfill the needs of tourism by taking those same tourists all across the densest portion of Anchorage, what does that do from a value proposition to businesses? We feel that we can quantify the statistics from that value base if we were able to do a 100% concept. And in order to, so if we are able to do that, and it's a risk factor, much as with anything in life, we can then finally begin to have a conversation with private businesses and developers to say, here is a quantifiable value that we're bringing into you. How can we then partner with you to diversify our funding so that we can then begin to match it better with the federal funds that we currently obtain federally? That begins to spur a renaissance of sorts that enables us to then, as time progresses, fill in the corridors that are left empty. But having not taken that level of risk, what we have is a status quo, and the 80% is no different than the status quo, because that value cannot be manifested and translated to the type of community businesses, as an example, that we're seeking the diversification of funding from.
Thank you. Mr. Flynn, did your question get answered?
Sort of not. May I follow up, please?
Please.
Thank you. What I think I heard is at this point, there's no additional appropriations that you would be expecting from the Assembly.
We are not.
On the capital or operating side.
Correct.
And that as an agency, your inclination is toward the 100% model, with the idea that you can attract funding from sources other than the general fund.
Only to the net benefit of how you diversify funding. So our inclination is neither, as you will note throughout the multitude of articles that we've been presented in, we've taken a very much a neutral approach to translating information from both the 80% and the 100%, and that's purposeful because we feel that we have a fiduciary responsibility to be net neutral to that effect. Nevertheless, what we're discovering is that people are abrasive to the 100% plan because they don't understand the finer nuances behind why the concept was even suggested. And so, from an educational process perhaps alone, I feel it my responsibility to ensure that you, at a minimum, are aware as to what the logic behind even suggesting the 100% was.
I don't have any further questions at this time, Madam Chair. At some point, if Mr. Smith could be invited to offer some thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
So I have two questions. I think Pat was kind of getting at this already, which is, we're never gonna take a vote on the Assembly saying whether it's 80% or 100%. We already gave you your funds. So we don't really have the ability to tell you to do one thing or the other. But obviously we wanna work together.
Absolutely.
And I guess I've talked to you before about this, and I prefer the 80% to the 100% for a variety of reasons. And I hope you go more in that direction, but either way, it's going to be a big change for the city. I have a more specific question about this sort of East Anchorage related, because there's a public meeting next week, I believe, at the Mulligan Library, and I think you are prepared and should be prepared for some very agitated citizens there, and a number of them. And And that's not just because of this, it's just because whenever you go to East Anchorage, you're gonna, we're passionate folks out there about public policy.
That was Mr. Dunbar saying.
We're passionate about, Northeast Community Council is a passionate group, but they, I think, have legitimate concerns about, you're creating this transit center. You already have a transit center in Old Town Square.
Yes.
But under either of these plans, there would be increased use and ridership of there. And so the questions I've been getting about, what, and this would be a preview for me, and then I'm sure you'll present it at that time too. For those areas that are going to get heavier use, are you talking about more cuts so the buses can pull out? Are you talking about a new stand? What kind of new facilities are you planning to minimize traffic or disruption?
So two things, one really quickly. One is, because it affects you, we've been in coordination with entities that are specific to Centennial Village. So this is to say, where there are areas that are affected and we feel that we have a viable solution, we've already worked in the background to be able to obtain that solution. So for Centennial Village, as an example, we are working to see if there can be a public-private partnership that enables diversification of funds for that facility to utilize one of our other mechanisms, whether it's band pool or anchor rides, to compensate for that variable. You asked about infrastructure, which the Assembly Member Flynn did. So right now, what we're doing is strategizing what we might be able to do in the small amount of time that there is an expectation of turning this around, and the expectation is August of 2017. That's not a lot of time. So for the here and now, between now and August 2017, we're not going to substantially change our infrastructure. On the back end, we are conversing with the FTA to figure out what the kosher approach is from a fiduciary responsibility standpoint of what occurs with FTA assets for the areas that we would no longer service. In terms of the future of what that infrastructure looks like, well, we begin to have conversations, and we're already engaged in those with the state. Does it look like a temporary easement on right-of-way that the state owns because it's state-owned arterials? And what does that easement permit look like? Does that mean that it's a on-street bus stop because we don't have the time period to do pull-outs, as an example? So those conversations are ongoing. As time progresses, and depending on which model comes forward, then do we even begin to have conversations that say that since we're no longer doing hub and spoke as a concept and we're doing grid line systems, then do our shelter concepts change? Because if more people are meeting more buses on primary routes, then you can no longer do your existing model of open type shelters. That paradigm has to shift. But those are conversations in their infancy. And so maybe as time progresses, what you look at is a conversation of right-of-way acquisition, if you can have it, towards the enablement of creating facilities that are a lower cost from a capital standpoint, but fulfill the purpose of how to keep people warm in the winter, as an example, while they're trying to make those connections, even if on average, say under the 100% plan, those connections are every 7 minutes where the two red lines meet. So that's what we're looking at from a structural capital standpoint. And I think it behooves us to share that our capital assets largely are 80%, up to 90% federally funded. So it's just a matter of that 10 to 20% operating match. But this conversation up to the point of execution would be a 2 to 3 year conversation as time progresses. Right now, our presumption is that we would utilize our existing structure, have agreements with the state in terms of easements for bus stops at locations that are in the right of way, until we get to a point where we can begin to imagine what Anchorage would look like with its needed transportation system and what those assets look like as time progresses.
So I think that's all well and good. I support that, but I think you need to have a more refined answer specifically about basically DeBar and Muldoon, that area right there where we've already had, we've had people run across the road and get struck by cars. There's already quite a lot of buses in there, and we're talking about putting a lot more buses in there, which I'm very supportive of. But there are other people in the community that are worried about congestion and crashes and that kind of thing in that specific area. Maybe you want to go back around Fred Meyer, for example, and talk about using the other route. But you don't have to give it right now. But before the meeting next week, I really hope you guys think of a really, really good answers, because people are gonna be asking you about it.
Thank
So
you.
if I may ask your opinion on it.
Yeah.
Right now, the principle behind this is straight lines enable us to do straight shoots and therefore reduces time. The more we turn around, the more deviations we do, the higher the cost of that money is.
Sure.
But in principle, if this isn't a transportation conversation, we're just victims of it, because it's really a conversation of what roads look like
Sure.
in Anchorage, and that's a state and municipal level conversation. I would say that if our buses start to be on major roads predominantly, then that almost propels a conversation to dissect the issue of really, is it appropriate to have 50 or 45 mile an hour throughput through these major roads? Or does the density now support a re-envisionment of those roads and arterials to where they're conducive to the density?
If you can make that argument, I can tell you the community council is very supportive of dropping the speed on Holton, but
Okay.
a lot of other people probably won't.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Training.
This map, both this 100%, the 80%, how do they service the Diamond Mall? Because there is a transit hub there to Diamond Mall, and they've got no business going in, it's gonna be open to midnight. And that's become an employment hub for Anchorage. Do you envision that as part of your area you service for Diamond Mall itself?
Absolutely.
I can't tell by your little map, sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. So what we realized was that we've been committed in a multitude of plans that the municipality has signed off on. So toward that endeavor, we even though it stretches our funding, we cannot pull out of areas like Independence Park or Jewel Lake and 88. So to that effect, what you see under the 100% plan is our ability to mitigate those challenges by simply, in principle, saying we have the seed money to put a smaller vehicle out there that costs less. And so, under this dotted line that you see on both ends, both of which lead to the Diamond Center, this is our way of compensating for exactly that, the demand management aspect of the folks that live in Independence Park, but are localized by working at, say, the Diamond Transit Center. Again, it's two vehicles running hourly service, and that's just seed money. What we're doing on the back end is having conversations with the Diamond Center to be able to say that either through your tenants, or you as an entity, or the businesses surrounding, can we get enough buy-in to perhaps we can get another $175,000, if you will, to add one additional vehicle to that same dotted line. And if we can do that, then what that does is changes it from 1 hour to 45 minutes. But again, those are partnerships that we've not engaged in previously, and so this is a fundamental shift in the philosophy of how we do transportation. But we realized that the Transit Center was, the Diamond Transit Center was a hub. To that effect, the Route 9 is still, it's 30 minutes leading down Arctic, going to the Diamond Center. We are investing a sizable amount of federal resources to be able to modify the arterial Diamond Center Boulevard road, leading into the Diamond Center to make sure that our buses are able to get in and out in a appropriate amount of time. So we are still committed to the Diamond Center. We are sending our routes down there. All we're saying in terms of these dotted lines is that this is the seed money that we have based on the existing budget, short of coming back and saying we need more money. And as time progresses, then we want to build on that, where these solid, these dotted lines become more solid as time progresses.
Thank you, Mr.
If
Training.
you change the paradigm on bus shelters to heated bus shelters, then you can provide security there. Given a high transit population, you got people living in those. So how are you gonna provide security to make sure that isn't happening?
So,
So if you heat them and close them, you're gonna have people living in there.
agreed. So on the back end, this may be helpful. I'm assuming the Assembly was aware of the multitude of assaults that even occurred on our employees as time has progressed over the past 2 years, and those seem to be increasing as time progresses. We don't have transit police, but on the back end, we did begin looking at what a contractual mechanism might look like to retain private vendors to serve as quasi-transit police. Right now, the dollar figure that we've had on hand is roughly around $275,000 would enable us to have a contingency on board our vehicles that serves in a similar mechanism to what a transit police would do. But this would be private security, they would not have weapons. They would be able to tail our buses, go from bus to bus, to mitigate issues that arise, both from a fare standpoint and dispute standpoint on our vehicles, and to address issues at shelters. But again, that's us trying to figure out how to scrape the bottom of the barrel to come up with the $275,000 within the existing confine to be able to remedy that issue.
We raise the cost of the fare to cover that, which never is.
It never is.
Thank you,
Madam Chair.
thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Croft?
Yeah, thank you for the way you approached this whole thing up. This has been very interesting since the concept first was introduced, at least to me, maybe others were familiar with it. As you go to 80 and then 100, we get more efficient, right?
Way more efficient.
What is a sort of estimates of productivity? So productivity is I should read that as a how full are the buses number, very general. Yeah. And the average productivity, we're in the low 20s. Do we have estimates of what it gets to in an 80 and a 100?
The closest model that I think we can share with you, because it's very hard to do
Sure.
from a modeling standpoint. The closest model that we can tell you is a replica of a change that occurred in Houston. And so initially what happened when they made the change was a drop in ridership for the first 2 years to the tune of about 2 to 3%. But most recently, as of the last month, what we were able to see is that their ridership has actually shot up, whereas the towns around them have actually shot down. So as time progresses, maybe in the 3 to 4 year horizon, what you see is an upshoot of close to about 3 to 5%. Just because you gain that level of efficiency and you build that ridership base, because people see the value of not having to schedule around transportation 2 hours at a time.
People that are on these newly read routes that didn't take the bus because it was not convenient enough for them slowly change their habits and start
Yes.
to take the bus. And so that must lead to either having more money, or your model is just plow it right back into bus routes. So you're keeping the same subsidy from us, and you're just going to be able to do more with it.
Yes.
But when you get to 100%, you could provide the same service and take less money.
So there is a thought process that says that, well, if your ridership increases, then naturally what that means is somehow the money increases.
Yeah.
And I would say that, in having done our research on the back end through our federal funding, what we determined is that the complication of the formula is such that even if you see a ridership increase of, say, 50,000, say it's even 100,000, it doesn't substantially change the amount of federal allocation that we're given, because it's dependent on a comparison to all the other systems all across the lower 48. So that doesn't change. But what that does do is the proposition that I shared initially, which is that you bring the value to the businesses and then have them enable public transportation by feeding back into it. So for example, if all it takes is seed money. So if we were able to upgrade our 15-year-old IT infrastructure system that runs these buses, and we were able to go with a new system, then by 2020, we would have buses that, as you're approaching a specific bus stop, we could actually utilize the advertisement. Let's say if it's Golden Donuts, as you're on Tudor, as the bus is pulling up a quarter mile prior to, you have a captive audience. You can say, Golden Donuts is coming up. But guess what that does from a business standpoint? They are more likely to then invest back into transportation. Same thing, they can adopt a stop and say that we want to fund this stop in some mechanism from a crowdfunding sourcing standpoint. Or we could do what we haven't done to date, which is begin engaging these businesses and say, we're going to sell you in bulk our passes. You can go to Cars, you can go to Fred Meyer's, and we're going to discount this as a business to you up front, but depending on the volumes that you sell, this is the revenue that we're expecting on the back end. It starts to basically bring them into the public transportation domain in a level and a magnitude that just hasn't existed here.
And the actual fare increase is a pretty minuscule part of your budget. That you didn't mention that with 50,000 or 100,000 more riders, you're getting that fare. You mentioned the federal funding. Is it because that's not a huge difference maker for you?
It's, right, again, those numbers are hard to predict. Somebody posed the question in terms of, well, what happens, are you you're going to see a reduction in fare revenue, if you move to a 100% model. Absolutely, we would. But the scale of it is such, depending on what occurs. So for example, right now.
We thought we're increasing efficiency. I thought we'd increase ridership.
Yes, but your base population is still 300,000, and so the amount of riders that you're going to be able to get on board is still limited by that. And maybe in 5 years, the fare as it currently stands is increased to such a point that you can better leverage the revenue. But fundamentally, it's very difficult to qualify that from a statistical standpoint.
And one more question. Thank you, Madam Chair, for letting me ask multiple. How much is transit and our evolving sense of land use and how we want to add density in certain areas? How much are you two talking about? Because there's a chicken and egg here of we're serving what is and we're planning for what will be.
I think that's an excellent point. We have on the back end been coordinating with long-range planning on exactly that, to the tune of saying, well, can transportation be utilized as an experiment to a certain degree? If you go to a 100% model, to bring in developers to contribute towards infill strategies along areas that require that level of revitalization. And if you can, then what does that do to us as a community from a taxpayer standpoint, but also from a transportation standpoint? As with a multitude of locations all across the U.S., there is a marriage that occurs between land use and transportation. Ours is a higher hill to climb, if you will, because those conversations have to date not fully occurred or manifested.
I think they were unheard of largely until the last 2 years, maybe.
But we're making a very strategic effort to make sure that all of our plans on the back end are beginning to align themselves. Because it just makes sense.
So that's the end. And so are you putting the red lines, in my simplest way, are you putting the red lines where the people are or where you think the people will be who want to use the bus?
It's a combination of both.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Crowe. Mr. Evans?
Really quickly, I know we're running out of time. Mostly I just want to impress people by how well read I am. To say that I was just reading The Power Broker, which was a story of Robert Moses, who built the infrastructure of New York City in the 30s and 60s, and how it was disastrous because they didn't take into account essentially the importance of public transportation in doing that. So I have tremendous respect and newfound respect for how public transportation is vital and how it has to fit into an overall plan for the city. With that in mind, I do support the 100% concept. Not that we're voting on it or anything, but I do think you're on the right track. I think it is smart, thoughtful, and it builds the right base for a stronger public transportation system going forward. And just had one question, almost completely unrelated to this, but has there ever been any discussions that you're aware of, or anybody else really in the administration, on the creation of a regional transit authority capable of bonding between Matsu and Anchorage? There has been, okay, and because it seems like that would be a gap that, especially with Eagle River and things like that, if you had a different authority that its funding is entirely different, providing a transit source, buses, I know people talk about rail and stuff like that, primarily buses, is it part of the long-term plans?
You may not necessarily need, or whatever my experience having been in DC for most of my life is where you don't need a regional transit entity to begin legitimizing, if you will, the blend all the way leading up to a SILA. There is a source of money that's federally allocated that already exists out there that we, because being urban, cannot go after. But it is utilized in Girdwood as an example. It's the 5311 funding. So through communication, through dialogue, through political support, if the appetite exists, as time progresses, there might be an appetite to say that can we do some sort of contractual understanding that legitimizes that entire shed through a pot of money that doesn't affect any of this. And mine to you is that the pot of money exists.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Anything else? Mr. Flynn, do you want to follow up? Thank
Good.
you. Mr. Mbosky, Mr. Steele, do you have any questions?
Not at this time, thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Steele?
Just a comment. It's a great conversation. I was looking forward to great upheaval in the Spenard area because of what we had with some buses earlier. People were really wanting that stuff through the neighborhood, but when it was brought up the other night, there was no concern about that they wanted the frequency. So it'll be interesting to see what you come up with.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. I have a comment and, well, actually a question and comment. So, and it's a side note, okay, concerning ridership on holidays.
Yes.
What are the numbers? And I know that ridership on holidays, that you usually use a Saturday schedule. So, and you, can you answer that now, or, all right?
It helps to hire people smarter than you. So, yes, we do actually. So for Martin Luther King as an example, actually, no, let's start with New Year's Eve. The ridership was 9,700 for New Year's Eve. Christmas, 6,800. Martin Luther King, 8,800. President's Day, 9,000. Really hovering between 8,000 and 12,000 at the highest.
Okay, and what's the average daily ridership? How much?
11,000.
So, kind of close. And so my next question is, based on all the changes that are being made, and I know that through the budget process that the holidays were eliminated,
Yes.
is there a possibility that maybe some of the holidays can come back because of all the changes that are being made?
So I do not believe.
Because I've been giving folks hope, it may be false hope, but
So I do not believe I'd be speaking out of turn because I believe Mike Abbott had suggested that part of what we were willing to look into is that if something worthwhile occurs in August, then part of the consideration will be whether holiday service is restored August on. So yes.
well, that answers my question. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, if I may, I believe our chair of the Public Advisory, Transportation Advisory Board might have had a comment to share with the Assembly.
Certainly, feel free to make your comment.
Yeah, thank you. I've spent 3 nights this last week in public hearings, listening to the public, mostly riders. In fact, I rode the 102 out to Eagle River with people who use that service, and we heard a lot of opposition to this plan, understandably so. I think that the members of the Transit Board are really keeping an open mind on this. We did a lot of work on the front end toward pushing this philosophy of how do we fix a broken system. Ridership has been steadily declining over a number of years, and so what can we do to make this system stronger rather than continue to fight the same battles every year in terms of cutting funding. We have 3 more hearings next week, and I think that we're kind of balancing the comments from people who don't understand what we're actually doing here and who haven't read the report and the information and the data that has gone into putting these concepts together with the people who actually do understand it and really are listening to the people who ride this system. And we recognize there are people who are going to be impacted for better and definitely people who will be impacted for worse because some service will go away. Really encouraged by the fact that the staff of the department are communicating with land use planners and long-range planners over that, and I do want to tip my hat to the staff for addressing a lot of the concerns from riders one-on-one. They've just really kind of gone above and beyond to solicit comments from the public, to really do a lot of proactive outreach on this, even though we are hearing people say, oh, you know, I never knew anything about this. It's like, I think you're always going to hear some of that when you look at making changes as dramatic as this, but I can tell you these concepts were not created in a vacuum. There was a lot of deliberate effort that has gone into this over a long period of time for almost a year now at this point. So still waiting to hear some more public comments, and I expect we're going to have some specific recommendations for you all after our January meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And as everybody knows here, there was also outside consultant who was helpful in assisting the transit department. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so you rode the 102, how many people were on the bus?
There were about 15 people on the one bus that I rode out there with, and these were, yeah, there isn't a lot of service out there as it is, so those buses, you know, the fewer buses that go out there, the more people are gonna be on the ones that do go out there.
And so with your conversations with the people, these were people that rode that route regularly, daily, to come into work or that type of thing, right?
You know, I can't say that specifically, but I would assume so. I don't suspect that they were just sort of joyriding out there like I was. I felt like a tourist out there for sure, but I suspect that a lot of them were regular users.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Madam Chair, if I may. This is a very good point to highlight one aspect of the branding within the umbrella of public transportation. So our takeaway from that community was that they commute for work, and it's an 8 to 5 level concept. Well, previously, we weren't able to do van pooling to that community. We went back and we changed that. So now, we, as of the last meeting, gone back and said, we are willing to go ahead and put you on a SUV, 5 at a time, and we're even willing to work with your employers to subsidize that further because we're already federally subsidizing it to where it's zero cost to you. And I believe, having said all of that, even though 5 of them were going to the same employer downtown and were at the same location, we only had 2 signups. So, where there are solutions, we are more than happy to accommodate them because that's a source of money that is underutilized.